Okay, so we've just looked at the fight, flight, freeze threat response and some of its potential costs for change makers. What are the alternatives? Well, as I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at this at three levels. The I level of what happens in our own lives, the we level of what happens in our relationships at home and at work, and then the world level of how we're trying to change the state of the world. Let's start first of all with the I level. The fact is that when we're in that fight, flight, freeze state, we're less good at making decisions. We're less effective at doing our work. And as I mentioned before, it can come with the risk of burnout. The good news is that we do have the ability to choose something different. This is something that was captured beautifully by Viktor Frankl, the famous psychotherapist who was a survivor of the concentration camps in World War II. And from his experience in the camps, he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And a quote from that is that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And what Frankl is getting at here is that although our amygdala will try to automatically take us into that fight, flight, freeze state, we do have the power to choose something different if we have enough kind of conscious self-awareness to be able to make that choice in that space that he's talking about here. And there is a neurological basis to what he's talking about. If the amygdala right at the bottom of our brains is the part of us that activates fight, flight, freeze, there's also another part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex here at the front of our heads, which is in charge of imaginative, critical, and reflective thinking. Now, if we can put our prefrontal cortex, the PFC as psychologists call it, in the driving seat in moments when we feel threatened, rather than letting our amygdala hijack our response, then we're able to respond from a much more considered place. But here's the thing, it takes work to be able to do that, both in the heat of the moment and ahead of time. In the heat of the moment, we're at absolute risk of getting overwhelmed. It's something that people like soldiers or emergency first responders train for a lot because they know that in very, very stressful situations, it's so easy to become overwhelmed and you can literally have tunnel vision. We're just unable to kind of think consciously. We may just lurch into panic. So armies and emergency services spend a lot of time training people for how to overcome those feelings of fight, flight, freeze and get their prefrontal cortex into the driving seat. And it can be very nuts and bolts techniques, things like consciously focusing on our breathing, for example, or counting things in the environment, like how many things we can see that are red, for example, very kind of practical little things, but that give the prefrontal cortex, the conscious part of our minds, something to do, which is a way of getting it in the driving seat. And in this week's resources, we've got some links to materials that can offer links to trainings for how you can do that work. But the real work in terms of building our power to respond happens long before the moment when we're really in the thick of things. It's about, if you like, building the muscles, growing the muscles that give us that power to choose. And techniques like, for example, mindfulness, or like having a really good self-care regime are so important in growing that power to choose. And again, in the workbook, we've got lots of links on how you can do that. So that's some stuff about the I level. What about the we level? Our relationships with our friends and family, our teams, our organizations, and so on. Now, last week, we touched on the idea of social contagion, that in our very connected times, it's really easy for behaviors or emotions to kind of ripple through our social networks, so much so that they're almost like a collective central nervous system. And that's very true of fight, flight, freeze. Think of how panic can be really infectious. Most obvious example is when you have a kind of stampede in a large crowd or something. It can just ripple through the whole crowd. The good news is that it's also possible for us to respond collectively in a much more considered and self-aware way. One great example of what that can look like was the wave of COVID mutual aid groups that sprung up in so many communities during the first COVID lockdown back in 2019. What we saw was neighbors showing up for each other, kind of acting from compassion and just looking out for each other and doing a kind of collective form of self-help. It's also what we often see in the wake of major disasters, like earthquakes or hurricanes. And in these conditions, contrary to the urban myth of kind of looting and disorder and needing to declare martial law, actually what usually happens is you get tremendous levels of solidarity, heroism even, as people show up for each other and come together as a community. Now, what you're seeing in those kind of conditions is a phenomenon that psychologists call tend and befriend. It's quite a new idea in psychology. It's only been around since about the year 2000, but it's become very influential. And it's a different approach to fight, flight, freeze, one where instead of locking into kind of, that fight or flight sense, we're tending to ourselves and our immediate social groups. And we're also befriending other peoples to enlarge those social networks and build, if you like, coalitions for self-help. And in these conditions, it's kind of like the diametric opposite of fight, flight, freeze in terms of what's going on emotionally. For one thing, rather than becoming overwhelmed in the way that fight, flight, freeze quickly does, it's very practical. This is a form of threat response that rolls up its sleeves and gets on with it. It comes from a place of compassion and empathy. It's absolutely not an aggressive kind of response to perceived threat. It's not just focused on our individual safety. Rather, it's kind of looking at the community, at the common good. It creates a larger us rather than a smaller us or a them and us. And it's much better at critical or imaginative thinking. Think of the kinds of ingenuity that communities come up with after kind of shocks or emergencies, where people are really kind of, necessity is the mother of invention. And you see that in a community context. Now, where it gets really interesting for us as change makers is the question of whether there are ways that we can tap into tend and befriend in our change making, in the way that, for example, we design campaigns. And we think we can. One example that we like is this example of a campaign that happened in Northern Ireland to invite people to welcome refugees who'd recently arrived in the community, whether that's through writing them a card or offering them gifts of clothes or books or other things that they might need. A very kind of practical tend and befriend kind of response, and one that gave people not a sense of overwhelm, but a sense of agency, of being able to contribute constructively, and that led very much with compassion as the key value that's being expressed. Another example that we touched on last week is the case of We Belong, the NGO that I mentioned, which works for the rights of young people who arrived in Britain as children and campaigns for their rights as immigrants. We Belong a few years back ran a really interesting campaign where they were pushing the Home Office to shorten the length of time that children or young people have to wait before they can remain in the UK indefinitely. And they were confronting here a very unjust set of immigration rules that a lot of Conservative MPs in the British Parliament had voted for. Now, one option was for them to go out and kind of shame those MPs publicly in a way that, of course, would have created a lot of fight, flight, freeze, but would also have generated lots of media attention and so forth. But We Belong took a conscious decision to do something different. Instead of calling out those MPs publicly, they met with them privately and tapped into the power of their personal stories to create a kind of genuine encounter. A lot of the time, this was emotionally intensive work. The kind of volunteers involved were telling pretty raw stories of personal suffering and trauma. And a lot of self-care was involved in being able to do that kind of testimony. But they found that it was incredibly impactful with the MPs that they were talking to. And they were quickly able to convert a critical mass of Conservative MPs to support their call for a change in the immigration rules, leading to a breakthrough success and a situation where now in Britain, it does take much less time for people who arrived in the UK as children to get that indefinite leave to remain. So just to rattle through again, what characterizes these sorts of campaigns? They make challenges seem manageable. They deliberately avoid that sense of kind of overwhelm, of huge unmet need. They also create a sense of agency. Rather than making people feel passive in the face of the shock, they give them power to make a difference. And then finally, they lead with those values of compassion. And that's really important in how the campaigns as a whole are framed. So that's briefly 3 sets of things that we can potentially do in our own lives to build the kind of power to choose how to respond to things we perceive as threatening, in our relationships through that tend and befriend response, an alternative, much more pro-social form of threat response to fight, flight, freeze. And then finally, how we can bring tend and befriend into campaigning and change making and really build campaigns around those principles in ways that build a larger us.